The stranger wore death like a second skin, but her eyes held the color of prairie wildflowers after rain. Dust devils danced across Main Street as the afternoon stage rolled into Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, its wheels grinding against the hardpan like broken bones. Sheriff Jake Murdoch stood in the shade of the saloon's awning, his weathered hands resting easy on his gun belt, watching the passengers disembark. 3 men in city suits, a traveling preacher clutching his Bible, and then, her. She stepped down from the coach with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, her black mourning dress stark against the bleached landscape. The fabric whispered secrets as she moved, and Jake found himself straightening despite the warning bells clanging in his head. Something about her set his teeth on edge, the way a coming storm makes horses restless. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat as she approached, noting how her gloved hand never strayed far from the small reticule at her side. "Welcome to Copper Ridge." She lifted her veil, and Jake's breath caught. Raven black hair framed features that belonged in a Renaissance painting, sharp cheekbones, full lips, and those startling blue eyes that seemed to see straight through a man's soul. But it was the shadow behind her beauty that made his gun hand twitch. "Sheriff Murdoch." Her voice carried the faint trace of an accent he couldn't place, something European, refined. "I am Mrs. Victoria Blackwood. I believe you knew my late husband." The name hit him like a physical blow. Thomas Blackwood. The memory rushed back unbidden. The crack of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, the way Tom's eyes had gone wide with surprise before the light faded from them. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his chest, where the scar from Tom's bullet still ached on cold mornings. "Tom Blackwood was your husband." Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. "He was." She studied his face with those penetrating eyes. "He spoke of you often in his letters. Said you were the finest lawman in the territory." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Before you killed him, of course." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired gun. Jake felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders, the burden he'd carried for 3 years since that night outside the Silver Dollar. Tom Blackwood had been his best friend once, before the gambling and the drinking and the choice that had torn their friendship apart. "It was a fair fight," Jake said quietly. "You know that." "I know what the reports said." Victoria's fingers traced the edge of her veil. "I know my husband drew first. I know he was drunk and angry and looking for someone to blame for his troubles." She paused, her gaze never leaving his face. "I also know you could have wounded him instead of killing him." Jake had asked himself that same question 1,000 times. In the split second when Tom's hand had moved to his gun, when the whiskey-fueled rage had twisted his old friend's face into something unrecognizable, Jake had made the choice every lawman dreaded. The shot had been clean, merciful, straight to the heart. "Why are you here, Mrs. Blackwood?" She smiled then, and something in that smile made Jake's blood run cold. "To start over, Sheriff. Tom left me with nothing but debts and memories. I heard Copper Ridge was a place where a woman could make a new beginning, and you chose to make that beginning in the town where your husband died. Perhaps I wanted to see the place where Tom took his last breath. Perhaps I wanted to understand the man who ended his life." She stepped closer, close enough that Jake caught the scent of jasmine and something darker, something that reminded him of cold graveyards and fresh-turned earth. Or perhaps I simply wanted to meet the famous Jake Murdoch face to face. The way she said his name sent a shiver down his spine. There was something in her tone, a note of anticipation, hunger. Jake couldn't quite place it, but every instinct, honed by 15 years of wearing a badge, told him this woman was dangerous. "Where will you be staying?" he asked, though part of him hoped she'd say she was just passing through. "I've rented the cottage behind the church. Reverend Matthews was kind enough to arrange it through correspondence." Victoria adjusted her veil, preparing to leave. "I'm sure we'll be seeing quite a bit of each other, Sheriff. Copper Ridge is such a small town." Jake watched her walk away, noting the confident set of her shoulders, the way she seemed to glide rather than walk. Other men on the street stopped their conversations to stare, some with admiration, others with the wariness of prey animals sensing a predator. Mrs. Blackwood paused at the corner and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, Sheriff, I do hope you'll call on me soon. I have so many questions about my husband's final days." Her smile could have melted steel or frozen blood, depending on how you looked at it. I'm quite looking forward to our conversations. As she disappeared around the corner, Jake realized his hand had been resting on his gun, but the entire time. He forced himself to relax, but the tension remained coiled in his chest like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Deputy Cole Patterson emerged from the jail, his young face creased with concern. Who was that, Sheriff? She looked like trouble dressed. Up in silk. Jake kept his eyes on the empty corner where Victoria Blackwood had vanished. Tom Blackwood's widow. Cole whistled low. Well, I'll be damned. What's she doing here? That, Jake said, finally turning away from the street, is exactly what I intend to find out. But as he walked back toward the jail, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Victoria Blackwood had come to Copper Ridge with more than questions on her mind. Something in those blue eyes had spoken of secrets and vengeance, of a woman who had traveled a long way to settle an old score. What Jake didn't know was that the leather-bound journal hidden in Victoria's traveling case contained detailed plans for his death, plans she'd been perfecting for 3 long years. The cottage behind St. Mary's Church sat like a mourning dove among the cottonwoods, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Victoria Blackwood stood at the single window, watching Sheriff Murdoch's tall figure disappear into the jail across town. Her fingers traced the cool glass as she committed every detail of his face to memory, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his green eyes had flickered with old pain when she'd spoken Tom's name, the scar that peeked above his collar. She knew about that scar. Tom's final letter had described it in savage detail, along with his plans for revenge that death had cut short. Victoria opened her traveling case and withdrew the leather journal, its pages yellowed with 3 years of obsessive planning. She'd memorized every word, every carefully drawn map of Copper Ridge's streets, every detail of Jake Murdoch's daily routine gathered from Tom's bitter correspondence and her own careful inquiries. Day 1. Arrive. Establish presence. Let him see me, wonder about my intentions. Day 7. Attend church. Become part of the community. Make him believe I'm harmless. Day 14. Begin the seduction. Tom always said Murdoch was too honorable for his own good. Use that against him. Day 21. When his guard is down, when he trusts me, when he perhaps even loves me. Finish what Tom started. Victoria closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. 3 years of planning. 3 years of learning to shoot with deadly accuracy. 3 years of perfecting the art of becoming whatever a man needed her to be. She'd practiced her performance on a dozen unsuspecting souls during her journey west, leaving a trail of broken hearts and empty promises across 3 territories. But as she recalled the moment Jake Murdoch had first looked into her eyes, something unexpected twisted in her chest. She'd expected to see a cold-blooded killer, a man who could gun down his best friend without a second thought. Instead, she'd seen pain that matched her own, the weight of a choice that had cost him dearly. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Victoria slipped the journal beneath her pillow and smoothed her skirts before answering. Mrs. Blackwood, a round-faced woman with kind eyes, stood on the threshold, holding a covered basket. I'm Martha Patterson. My husband, Cole, is the deputy. I thought you might appreciate a hot meal after your journey. How thoughtful. Victoria accepted the basket, noting the way Martha's gaze flickered curiously around the sparse cottage. Please, come in. I'd welcome the company. Martha settled into the single wooden chair while Victoria unpacked the basket. Fresh bread, honey, cold chicken, and apple preserves. The domestic kindness felt foreign after years of calculating every interaction. You must have known Tom well, Martha said gently. He was a complicated man. Victoria's hand stilled on the preserves jar. You knew my husband? We all did. Tom worked for the widow Henderson sometimes, fixing her roof, mending fences. He was handy with his hands when he was sober. Martha's voice carried no judgment, only sadness. Jake tried to help him, more than once. The sheriff tried to help Tom. Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Oh yes, Jake gave him work when no one else would, paid his debts at the mercantile twice that I know of, even tried to get Tom to join the church temperance meetings. Martha shook her head. But Tom was carrying too much anger, too much pain. Some folks said he never got over losing his first wife in childbirth. Victoria's breath caught. First wife? You didn't know? Martha's eyes widened with horror at her mistake. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. I thought. I assumed Tom would have told you about Mary." The name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Mary, Tom's first wife. The woman whose memory had haunted their brief marriage, whose ghost had stood between them on their wedding night and every night after. Tom had drunk to forget Mary, gambled to escape the guilt of surviving when she hadn't, and when those didn't work, he'd taken his rage out on the world around him. He mentioned her once. Victoria lied smoothly, though her mind reeled. He said, "She died young. Such a tragedy. They were childhood sweethearts, married just 6 months when the fever took her and the baby both." Tom never recovered from it. Martha reached across to pat Victoria's hand. "I imagine that's why he treasured you so much. A second chance at happiness." Victoria nearly laughed at the bitter irony. Tom had treasured nothing about their marriage except her inheritance, which he'd gambled away piece by piece until nothing remained but empty bottles and cruel words. The man Martha described, grieving, broken, worthy of compassion, bore little resemblance to the husband who'd struck her when his luck ran bad, who'd blamed her for every failure in his worthless life. "Mrs. Patterson," Victoria said carefully, "what exactly happened the night Tom died?" Martha's face grew troubled. It was a foolish thing. Tom had been drinking at the Silver Dollar, losing money he didn't have. When Jake tried to calm him down, Tom accused him of cheating, said Jake had been working with the card sharp all along. She twisted her hands in her lap. Tom drew first, Mrs. Blackwood. Everyone saw it. Jake had no choice. And afterward, Jake carried Tom's body to the undertaker himself, paid for the funeral, even though Tom died owing money all over town. He stood over the grave for an hour after everyone else left. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. Cole found him there at midnight, still standing vigil. Jake blamed himself something fierce. Victoria stared out the window toward the jail, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling. She'd built her revenge on the foundation of Tom's letters, bitter, twisted accounts that painted Jake as a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered his best friend in a rigged game. But what if Tom had lied? What if the truth was something else entirely? "Why are you really here, Mrs. Blackwood?" Martha asked gently. "Copper Ridge is a long way from anywhere. Surely you had family back east who could help you start over?" Victoria turned back to face the deputy's wife, studying the genuine concern in her eyes. How easy it would be to tell the truth, to confess her plans for revenge, to admit she'd come here carrying a loaded gun and 3 years of hatred. But the words wouldn't come. "I wanted to see where Tom spent his final years," she said instead. "To understand what drove him to what happened." Martha nodded slowly. Perhaps talking to Jake would help. He knew Tom better than anyone toward the end. As Martha gathered her empty basket and prepared to leave, Victoria caught her arm. "Was Jake married? Does he have family?" "He was engaged once, years ago. Sarah Fleming." But she couldn't handle the dangers of being a lawman's wife. The waiting, the wondering if he'd come home each night. She married a banker from Phoenix instead. Martha's expression softened. "Jake's been alone ever since. Dedicated his life to keeping this town safe, but it's a lonely existence." After Martha left, Victoria sat in the gathering dusk, her mind churning with revelations that threatened to derail everything she'd planned. The journal under her pillow felt like a weight pressing against her conscience. Could she really kill a man who'd grieved over her husband's grave? A man who'd tried to save Tom from himself? As if summoned by her thoughts, Jake Murdoch appeared on the street outside her window. He moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence, but his face carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too much death, caused too much pain. Victoria watched him pause before her gate, his hand hovering over the latch as if debating whether to knock. In that moment of hesitation, she saw not the cold killer of Tom's letters, but a man haunted by the weight of necessary choices. Jake looked up suddenly, his eyes finding hers through the window. The connection lasted only a heartbeat before he touched his hat brim in a respectful nod and walked on. But Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the ice around her heart that she'd spent 3 years building. She pressed her palm against the cool glass where his image had been, her reflection ghost-like in the darkening pain. Tomorrow was Sunday. She would go to church, play the grieving widow, earn the town's sympathy and Jake's trust. She would follow her plan exactly as written, But as she prepared for bed, Victoria found herself thinking not of revenge, but of the loneliness she'd glimpsed in Jake Murdoch's eyes, a loneliness that matched her own more closely than she cared to admit. In her dreams that night, Victoria stood not at Tom's graveside, but at Mary's, watching Jake Murdoch carry flowers to a woman he'd never been able to save. Sunday morning painted Copper Ridge in shades of gold and amber, the desert air crisp with the promise of autumn. Victoria stood before her mirror, adjusting the modest black dress she'd chosen for church. High neckline, long sleeves, the picture of proper mourning. But beneath the conservative fabric, she'd strapped a small derringer to her thigh, its weight a cold reminder of her true purpose. The congregation of St. Mary's was smaller than she'd expected, perhaps 30 souls scattered across worn wooden pews. Victoria chose a seat in the back, noting how heads turned to study the mysterious stranger. Whispers followed her like smoke, speculation about the beautiful widow, curiosity about her connection to Tom Blackwood's tragic end. Jake Murdoch sat 3 rows ahead, his broad shoulders filling out a crisp white shirt, his dark hair slicked back with pomade. Victoria found herself studying the strong line of his neck, the way his calloused hands rested easily on his knees. When he turned slightly to acknowledge a neighbor's greeting, she caught a glimpse of his profile, the strong jaw, the straight nose, the eyes that held depth she was only beginning to fathom. Reverend Matthews was a thin, earnest man whose sermon on forgiveness felt like a personal challenge to Victoria's mission. "The Lord calls us to release our burdens of anger," he intoned, his voice echoing off the rough-hewn rafters. "To turn the other cheek, to love our enemies as ourselves." Victoria's fingers found the outline of the derringer through her skirts. How convenient that message would be for Jake Murdoch. Forgiveness for the man who destroyed her life, absolution without consequence. But as the Reverend's words washed over her, she found herself thinking of Martha's revelation about Tom's first wife, about the grief that had driven him to drink and violence. After the service, the congregation filed out into the morning sunshine. Victoria lingered in her pew, waiting for the crowd to thin when a shadow fell across her. "Mrs. Blackwood." Jake's voice was softer than she remembered, tinged with something that might have been regret. "Might I walk you home?" She looked up into those green eyes, searching for deception, for the coldness Tom's letters had described. Instead, she found only careful courtesy and something deeper, a pain that resonated with her own. "That would be kind, Sheriff." They walked in silence through the emptying churchyard, past weathered headstones and wild roses that bloomed despite the desert heat. Victoria was acutely aware of Jake's presence beside her, the measured pace of his stride, the way he unconsciously scanned their surroundings for threats, the faint scent of leather and soap that clung to his clothes. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jake said as they reached her gate. "About having questions. I reckon I owe you some answers about Tom." Victoria's pulse quickened. This was her opening, the chance to draw him closer, to make him trust her. "Would you like to come in? I could make coffee." Jake hesitated, his hand resting on the gate latch. "Wouldn't be proper, ma'am. A widow alone. The neighbors will think we're discussing my husband's death. Surely that's respectable enough." Victoria allowed a tremor to enter her voice, the performance of a grieving woman seeking closure. "Please, Sheriff. I've come so far for answers." The cottage felt smaller with Jake's presence filling it. He stood awkwardly near the door, hat in his hands, while Victoria busied herself with the coffee. When she turned back, she found him studying the single photograph on her mantelpiece, her wedding portrait with Tom. "You were beautiful," he said quietly. "Tom showed everyone that picture. Talked about you like you were some kind of angel sent to save him." Victoria's throat tightened. Tom had called her many things in their brief marriage, but never an angel. "He wrote to me about you as well." Jake's jaw tensed. "I reckon those letters weren't too flattering. He said you were the finest shot in the territory, that you'd been friends since boyhood, closer than brothers." Victoria poured the coffee, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "He also said you betrayed him." The words hung between them like a loaded gun. Jake accepted the coffee cup, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. Callous skin against silk gloves, a spark of connection that made her breath catch. "Tom wasn't wrong about the betrayal," Jake said finally. "Though maybe not the way he meant it." What do you mean? Jake moved to the window, staring out at the desert beyond. Tom had a problem with cards and whiskey. Been getting worse since he lost Mary. I tried talking to him, tried getting him work, even loaned him money when I shouldn't have. His voice dropped to a whisper. But when he started hitting women at the saloon, when he pulled a gun on old Mrs. Henderson over a gambling debt, I had to choose between my friend and my duty. Victoria set down her cup with shaking hands. He hit women, more than once. The girls at the Silver Dollar were afraid of him when he'd been drinking. And Mary Henderson, she's 70 years old, Mrs. Blackwood. Tom would have killed her over $20 if I hadn't stepped in. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Tom had never mentioned violence against other women in his letters, only his bitter rants about Jake's supposed treachery, his wild accusations of cheating and conspiracy. She thought of her own bruises, carefully hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars, the fear that had lived in her chest during those final months of their marriage. The night he died, Jake continued, his back still turned to her. Tom accused me of setting him up with a marked deck. Said I'd been working with the card sharp to cheat him. It wasn't true, but Tom was past listening to reason. Jake's shoulders sagged. When he went for his gun, I had maybe half a second to decide. Wound him and risk him getting off a shot, or kill him cleanly. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Jake turned then, and she saw the weight of that choice written in every line of his face. I've asked myself 1,000 times if I could have done it different. If I'd been faster, better, if I could have saved him somehow. Victoria stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. This wasn't the cold-blooded killer of Tom's letters. This was a man tortured by a choice no one should have to make. The choice between a friend's life and innocent people's safety. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? She asked. Would you have believed me? A stranger telling you your husband was something other than what you thought. Jake's eyes searched her face. Besides, speaking ill of the dead, it didn't seem right. Victoria moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. And now I think maybe you deserve the truth. All of it. They stood barely a foot apart, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window and catching the gold flecks in Jake's green eyes. Victoria could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the pulse beating in his throat. This close, she could count the silver threads in his dark hair, trace the path of the scar that disappeared beneath his collar. There's something else, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. Tom talked about you constantly those last months. Said you were the only good thing in his life, the only reason he had to get better. I think he really did love you, in his way. Tears she hadn't expected blurred Victoria's vision. He had a strange way of showing it. Jake reached out instinctively, his hand cupping her cheek with surprising gentleness. Did he hurt you? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with terrible understanding. Victoria leaned into his touch, her carefully maintained mask finally cracking. Not often. Only when he'd been drinking. Only when the gambling went bad. Christ. Jake's thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. Victoria looked up into his eyes and saw her own pain. Reflected there, the guilt, the self-recrimination, the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. In that moment, the distance between victim and protector, widow and sheriff, disappeared entirely. She rose on her toes and kissed him. That it was meant to be calculation, part of her plan to seduce and destroy him. But the moment their lips met, Victoria felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Jake's arms came around her, strong and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. His mouth was warm and tender, tasting of coffee and promises she'd forgotten how to believe. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jake's forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed. This is a mistake, he whispered. Yes, Victoria agreed, but neither of them moved away. You're grieving. I killed your husband. We can't. Victoria silenced him with another kiss, deeper this time, pouring 3 years of loneliness and pain into the connection between them. When they separated again, Jake's control was visibly fraying. I should go, he said, but his hands remained on her waist. Stay, Victoria whispered, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. Jake pulled back then, duty warring with desire in his expression. Not like this. Not when you're vulnerable, when I've got no right to. You have every right, Victoria said fiercely, more right than he ever did. The words hung between them, shocking in their honesty. Jake stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, and Victoria realized with crystal clarity that she'd reached the point of no return. The plan lay in ruins around her feet. The derringer strapped to her thigh felt like a cold accusation against her skin. She was falling in love with the man she'd come to kill, but outside the cottage window, a figure watched from the shadows, someone who knew exactly why Victoria Blackwood had come to Copper Ridge, and who had their own plans for Sheriff Jake Murdoch. The knock came at Victoria's door 3 hours after Jake had left, sharp and insistent against the evening quiet. She opened it to find a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean as a whip, with pale eyes that reminded her of winter ice and a smile that never reached them. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, I presume? His voice carried the refined accent of the Eastern cities, but something underneath it made her skin crawl. My name is Marcus Webb. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. Victoria's hand moved instinctively toward the derringer beneath her skirts. I'm sorry, Mr. Webb, but I don't believe we've met. Not directly, no. But your late husband spoke of you often during our business arrangements. Webb's smile widened, showing teeth too white and too sharp. May I come in? I have something that belongs to you. Every instinct screamed at Victoria to slam the door, but Webb was already stepping across the threshold, his movements smooth and predatory. He glanced around the modest cottage with obvious disdain before producing a leather portfolio from his coat. Tom owed me a considerable sum when he died, Webb said, settling uninvited into her single chair. $23,000, to be precise. Plus interest, of course. Victoria's blood turned to ice. That's impossible. Tom mentioned very little to his wife, I imagine. He was quite ashamed of his dependencies. Webb opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of papers. Gambling debts, mostly. Some unfortunate investments. A few personal loans to cover his more immediate needs. The documents looked authentic. Tom's signature sprawled across promissory notes and IOUs dating back 2 years. Victoria's hands shook as she examined them, recognizing the familiar loops and flourishes of her dead husband's hand. Even if these are legitimate, she said carefully, I have no money. Tom left me with nothing. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear. Webb leaned forward, his pale eyes glittering. You see, Tom offered something far more valuable than money as collateral for his final loan. He produced a folded letter from the portfolio, and Victoria's heart stopped. She recognized the stationery, expensive cream paper she'd used for her correspondence with Eastern suppliers for her late father's business. More importantly, she recognized the contents without reading them. A rather detailed confession, Webb continued, unfolding the letter with theatrical precision. Written in your own hand, describing your plans to murder Sheriff Jake Murdoch in revenge for your husband's death. Quite comprehensive, really, maps of the town, details of the sheriff's daily routine, even sketches of various methods. Victoria's mouth went dry. The letter had been one of many she'd written to organize her thoughts during the dark months after Tom's death. Therapeutic exercises she'd never intended to send. She'd thought she'd destroyed them all. Tom found this among your papers when he was looking for anything of value to sell, Webb explained. He brought it to me as insurance, proof that his wife was planning murder, should he ever need leverage. Fascinating reading, I must say. What do you want? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Webb's smile turned predatory. Originally, just payment for Tom's debts. But then I witnessed your touching encounter with the good sheriff this afternoon. Through your window. Such passion, such tenderness. It rather changes things, doesn't it? Victoria felt trapped, like a rabbit caught in the coils of a snake. You were watching us. I make it my business to observe my investments, Mrs. Blackwood. And you, my dear, are now my most valuable asset. Webb stood and moved to the window, his pale eyes scanning the darkening street. You see, I have other business in Copper Ridge. Sheriff Murdoch has been rather inconveniently interfering with my operations, shutting down my gambling houses, arresting my associates, making life quite difficult for a man of enterprise such as myself. You want me to kill him for you? Oh, my dear, we're well past that now. No, I want something far more exquisite. Webb turned back to her, his smile cold as a tombstone. I want you to break his heart first. Make him fall completely, utterly, in love with you. And then, when he's at his most vulnerable, when he trusts you absolutely, I want you to watch me put a bullet in his brain." Victoria's hand closed around the Derringer's grip. "And if I refuse, then I deliver this charming confession to Deputy Patterson, along with testimony about your true purpose in Copper Ridge. You'll hang for conspiracy to commit murder, my dear. Frontier justice tends to be rather expeditious." Webb's voice dropped to a whisper. "But not before Sheriff Murdoch learns that every kiss, every tender word, every moment of intimacy was part of an elaborate plan to destroy him." The threat hit Victoria like a physical blow. She could see it in her mind. Jake's face when he learned the truth, the way the light would die in his green eyes when he realized she'd come here to kill him. The knowledge would destroy him more thoroughly than any bullet. "You're a monster," she breathed. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Blackwood. Nothing more, nothing less." Webb moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "You have until tomorrow night to arrange a private meeting with the sheriff. Somewhere isolated, romantic. The old mine shaft outside town would be perfect. Make him believe you're ready to consummate your relationship." Victoria felt bile rise in her throat. "And then I'll be waiting in the shadows with my gun, and you'll get to watch the man you've fallen in love with die knowing he meant nothing to you." Webb opened the door, evening air rushing in like a cold promise. "Oh, and Mrs. Blackwood, don't even think about warning him. I have associates watching both of you. One word of treachery, and that confession goes straight to the authorities." After Webb left, Victoria sank to her knees on the cottage floor, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The Derringer fell from nerveless fingers as she pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to drown her. She was trapped, caught between her growing love for Jake and the impossible choice Webb had forced upon her. If she went through with the plan, Jake would die believing she'd never cared for him. If she refused, he'd learn the truth about her original intentions and be destroyed in a different way. Either path led to his destruction and her damnation. Outside, thunder rumbled across the desert as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Victoria could smell rain in the air, the first she'd sensed since arriving in Copper Ridge. It seemed fitting that the heavens would open just as her world fell apart, that a soft knock interrupted her despair. Victoria wiped her eyes and opened the door to find Jake standing on her threshold, concern etched across his weathered features. "Saw a stranger leaving your place," he said, rain beginning to speckle his shirt. "Everything all right?" Victoria stared up at him. This good man who'd tried to save her husband, who carried the weight of necessary violence with such grace, who'd kissed her like she was something precious. How could she destroy him? How could she let him be destroyed? "Jake," she whispered, and then she was in his arms, clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. "Hey, easy now." His voice was gentle as he stroked her hair. "What's got you so spooked?" Victoria pulled back to look at his face, memorizing every line, every plane, every fleck of gold in his green eyes. If these were to be their last hours together before Webb's deadline, she wanted to remember everything. "Stay with me tonight," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "Please, I don't want to be alone." Jake's hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized. "We're falling." "Victoria, if this is about what happened earlier, it's not about regret," she said fiercely. "It's about tomorrow. About not knowing what tomorrow will bring." Thunder crashed overhead as the storm finally broke, rain beginning to fall in earnest. Jake searched her face in the lamplight spilling from the cottage, seeing something there that made his expression grow grave. "You're scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "Terrified," Victoria admitted. Jake glanced at the storm, then back at her face. "All right, but I sleep on the floor." "Your reputation." Victoria silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her desperation and love and fear into the connection between them. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "My reputation is the least of my concerns," she whispered against his lips. They spent the night talking in whispers while rain drummed against the roof. Victoria learned that Jake had once wanted to be a teacher, that he read poetry in his spare time, that he'd joined the Union Army at 16 and still woke sometimes dreaming of Gettysburg. She told him about her father's shipping business, about the books she'd loved as a child, about dreams she'd buried when she married Tom. They didn't make love. Some unspoken agreement held them back from that final intimacy. Instead, they held each other in the narrow bed, sharing warmth and whispered confessions as the storm raged outside. Near dawn, as Victoria lay listening to Jake's steady breathing, she made her choice. She couldn't save herself, but she could save him. She would meet Webb's deadline and arrange the rendezvous, but she wouldn't let Jake walk into that trap defenseless, even if it meant sacrificing everything: her freedom, her life, any chance at the happiness she'd glimpsed in Jake's arms. She would find a way to warn him. Love, she realized, sometimes meant choosing someone else's life over your own heart. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, Victoria pressed a soft kiss to Jake's temple and whispered words she'd never thought she'd mean. I love you. Jake stirred in his sleep, his arm tightening around her protectively, and Victoria closed her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. Tomorrow night, one way or another, this would all be over, but Victoria didn't know that Deputy Cole Patterson had spotted Webb entering her cottage, or that the young lawman was already suspicious of the stranger who'd been asking too many questions about Sheriff Murdoch's routine. The old mine shaft sat like a wound in the desert hillside, its mouth dark and forbidding against the sunset sky. Victoria arrived first, her heart hammering against her ribs as she checked the small pistol hidden in her coat pocket. Not the Derringer Webb expected, but her father's service revolver, loaded with 6 shots of desperate hope that she'd spent the day playing her part perfectly, sending Jake a note asking him to meet her here for a private conversation about their future. The lie had tasted like ashes in her mouth, but Webb's pale eyes had been watching from the shadows of the mercantile, ensuring she followed his script. What Webb didn't know was that Victoria had also left a second note, hidden beneath the sugar bowl in Martha Patterson's kitchen while visiting that afternoon. A confession of everything: her original plan, Webb's blackmail, the trap waiting at the mine. If her desperate gamble failed, at least someone would know the truth. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Victoria's breath catch. Jake appeared on the ridge, his silhouette dark against the dying light. He dismounted and walked toward her, with that easy confidence she'd come to love, his eyes warm with the promise of romance under the stars. This is some view, he said, settling beside her on the flat boulder she'd chosen. Though I have to say, it's mighty isolated for a lady to be riding out alone. Victoria's throat tightened. I wanted privacy. To talk about us. Jake's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. I've been thinking about us too. About what happened last night, what it means. And what does it mean? Victoria asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. It means I'm falling in love with you, Jake said simply. Hell, I think I've been falling since the moment you stepped off that stage. Probably makes me 7 kinds of fool, but there it is. Victoria closed her eyes against the pain that lanced through her chest. Jake, there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I really came to Copper Ridge. I know. The quiet words made Victoria's eyes snap open. Jake was watching her with those steady green eyes, but now she saw something else there. A sadness that matched her own. You know, she whispered. About the revenge plan? About the confession letter? About Marcus Webb? Jake's thumb stroked across her knuckles. Cole found your note this afternoon. Been quite a day for revelations. Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her. Then why did you come? Because I love you, Jake said simply. Because I know the difference between the woman who planned to kill me and the woman who spent last night in my arms. Because sometimes a man's got to trust his heart over his head. Jake, Webb is here. He's watching us right now, waiting to put a bullet in my back while you watch. Yeah, I figured as much. Jake stood slowly, his hand never leaving hers. Question is, what are we going to do about it? Before Victoria could answer, the sound of slow applause echoed from the mine entrance. Marcus Webb emerged from the shadows like a pale spider, his gun drawn and trained on Jake's chest. Touching, Webb said, his voice dripping with mock sentiment. Absolutely touching. Though I must say, Sheriff, you're not nearly as surprised as I expected. Hard to be surprised when you've got a deputy watching your back, Jake replied calmly. Cole's been tracking you since yesterday, Webb. We know about the gambling operation in Tucson, the protection racket in Phoenix. You're finished. Webb's smile never wavered. Perhaps, but I'll have the satisfaction of killing you first. And your lovely widow here will have the pleasure of watching. His pale eyes fixed on Victoria. Unless, of course, she'd prefer to do the honors herself. You did bring a gun, didn't you, my dear? Victoria's hand trembled as she drew the revolver from her coat. Both men watched her, Jake with perfect trust, Webb with hungry anticipation. The weight of the gun felt enormous in her shaking hands. That's it, Webb purred, pointed at his heart. 3 years of planning, 3 years of hatred. This is your moment, Mrs. Blackwood. Victoria raised the gun, and for a heartbeat the desert held its breath. Then she spun and fired, the bullet catching Webb in the shoulder and spinning him around. His own shot went wide, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Jake moved with lethal grace, his Colt clearing leather before Webb could recover. But the gambler was faster than he looked, rolling behind a boulder and returning fire. The bullet scored Jake's arm, drawing blood but not stopping him. Victoria, get down, Jake shouted, but she was already moving, flanking wide to get a clear shot at Webb's position. The gunfight that followed was brief but vicious. Webb was skilled and desperate, using the rocky terrain to his advantage. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the bond between the two people he'd tried to manipulate. Victoria and Jake moved like partners who'd danced this deadly ballet before, covering each other's movements, anticipating each other's needs. When Webb broke from cover to make a run for his horse, Victoria was ready. Her second shot took him in the leg, sending him sprawling in the dust. Jake was on him in seconds, kicking away his gun and pressing the Colt's barrel to Webb's temple. Move and I'll scatter your brains across this desert. You can't kill me in cold blood, Sheriff, Webb gasped, his pale face twisted with pain and rage. You're too honorable, too righteous. Maybe, Jake said quietly, but she's not. Victoria stepped into view, her father's revolver trained on Webb's heart. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes held the cold promise of death. You threatened the man I love, she said softly. You tried to use my past against me, to make me an instrument of destruction. But love, Mr. Webb, is stronger than hate. It transforms everything it touches. Webb's eyes widened as he saw his death in her unwavering gaze. You can't. The law will understand completely. A new voice interrupted. Deputy Cole Patterson emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, his rifle trained on Webb, especially when they hear about the kidnapping, the blackmail, the attempted murder. He grinned at Victoria. Got your note just in time, ma'am. Been quite educational, following this snake around town. As Cole secured Webb with iron shackles, Jake drew Victoria into his arms. She was shaking now, the adrenaline of the gunfight, giving way to emotional exhaustion. It's over, Jake murmured against her hair. It's all over, is it? Victoria pulled back to look at his face. Jake, the things I planned, the reason I came here, the reason you came here was grief and pain and a desire for justice, Jake said firmly. The reason you stayed was love. That's all that matters now. But the town, when they learn the truth, will see what I see. Jake interrupted. A woman who chose love over revenge, who risked everything to save someone else. A woman worth loving. 3 months later, Victoria stood in her garden behind the cottage, tending the roses she'd planted where only dust and thorns had grown before. The blooms were small but vibrant, red as passion, white as forgiveness, pink as new hope. Jake found her there as the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his strength with perfect trust. Mrs. Murdoch, he murmured against her ear. How does that sound? Victoria turned in his arms, her face glowing with happiness, like a new beginning. They'd married quietly the week before, with Cole and Martha Patterson as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Reverend Matthews had spoken again of forgiveness and redemption, of love's power to transform even the darkest hearts. Marcus Webb had been transported to territorial prison in Yuma, carrying Victoria's confession letter as evidence of his crimes. The document that had once threatened to destroy her had become the instrument of his downfall. Proof of the blackmail and coercion that had driven his schemes. As Jake and Victoria walked hand in hand toward their cottage, The desert wind carried the scent of blooming roses and the promise of rain. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the quiet contentment of two souls who had found their way home. "Do you ever wonder," Victoria asked softly, "what would have happened if Tom had made different choices?" Jake considered the question, his thumb stroking across her wedding ring. "I think Tom's story ended the way it had to. But ours is just beginning." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bright as hope, eternal as love. Victoria had come to Copper Ridge carrying death in her heart, but she'd found life instead. Messy, complicated, beautiful life that bloomed like roses in the desert. And somewhere in the growing darkness, she could swear she heard the whisper of wind through graveyards transformed into gardens, the sound of second chances taking root in barren ground. Well now, if that tale of love conquering vengeance didn't warm your heart like a desert sunrise, I reckon nothing will. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of romance under the endless western sky.